free agency, the moment that we have all been waiting for. And boy, did things start off with a bang. I'm sure that you've already seen the news, but it was just announced that Angel Reese has been traded from the Chicago Sky to the Atlanta Dream. Now, this is actually something that didn't surprise me. I actually didn't expect to see Angel Reese in a Chicago Sky jersey this season, especially with how her season ended last year with the Chicago Sky. There was clearly some friction between her and seems like Angel Reese is very happy to be going to Atlanta. But the thing that did surprise me about this trade is the details of it. So let me break it down for you guys. So Atlanta will receive, of course, Angel Reese and the right to swap a second-round pick with the Chicago Sky in 2028. Now, the Chicago...
Before Angel Reese signed a single document with the Atlanta Dream, the Indiana Fever's 2025 schedule was already written, and buried inside that calendar was a detail that nobody in the league office has come close to explaining. Indiana versus Atlanta 4 times this season, more matchups than against any other franchise in the WNBA. That schedule was finalized before the trade announcement, before the press release, before any of this was public knowledge. So the question you should be sitting with right now is a simple one. How does a scheduling algorithm predict a trade that hadn't happened yet? The WNBA wants you to accept a clean narrative here. Chicago evaluated their roster, decided Angel Reese no longer fit their long-term vision, and executed a trade during free agency. A franchise moves on. A player finds a new home. Standard business in a league with enormous off-season activity. But 2 things obliterate that clean narrative the moment you examine them side by side. First, the return Chicago accepted. 2 future first-round picks from the Atlanta Dream. Their 2027 and 2028 selections, plus the right to swap a second-round pick in 2028. That is the entirety of the package. No established players crossing into Chicago, no immediate difference-making assets, 2 lottery tickets from a franchise that finished last season as a legitimate playoff contender, which means those picks could easily fall outside the lottery entirely depending on how Atlanta develops with Reese on the roster. For a player who generated national headlines every single week, sold merchandise across every market she visited, drove viewership every time she stepped on the court, and turned road games into legitimate events, that is not a fair market return. That is what an organization accepts when it is trying to exit a situation, not
the Dream's 2027 first-round pick and the Dream's 2028 first-round pick. That's it, you guys. 2 first-round picks for Angel Reese. That is it. And if we look at the Atlanta Dream from last season, they were a really solid team. So adding Angel Reese to the mix with this Atlanta Dream team, if they're able to keep the roster at all similar to what they had last year, especially with players like Alicia Gray, like Ryan Howard, who knows if Bree Jones will stay, Jordan Canada was on that roster. Like if they're able to keep some of those key players, this Atlanta Dream team is definitely going to be a scary squad. And what is Chicago going to do now? Like obviously with this free agency period, it's going to be crazy. There are going to be so many big name players who are on teams that they weren't on last year. Like the entire league is going to look different. I've warned you guys about this. What is the Chicago Sky going to do? Like, do they have something else planned? Because this trade in itself, they lost this trade. And I would also like to know if there were any other teams that were interested.
Indiana facing Atlanta 4 times, more than any other opponent on the Fever's calendar. Constructed before the trade that made this the league's most commercially charged matchup even existed in the public record. And those 2 facts together, the desperation pricing on the trade and the convenient scheduling that followed, tell a story that goes well beyond Chicago's front office decisions. If this is already landing differently than what you've been reading everywhere else about this trade, hit that like button right now. We've been telling you for months that the real machinery operating behind this league runs deeper than what makes the highlight packages. And the Angel Reese trade may be the clearest window into that machinery we've ever had. To understand what is actually happening, you need to go back to April 2024 when the WNBA draft delivered something the league had genuinely never possessed before. 2 ready-made stars arriving simultaneously, carrying a shared history, a built-in storyline, and 2 enormous fan bases already primed for a rivalry the moment both players set foot on a professional court. Caitlin Clark, first overall pick, Indiana Fever. The point guard from Iowa, whose 4-year NCAA run had shattered scoring records that stood for decades, who had driven women's college basketball to its highest viewership numbers in the sport's history, and who arrived in the WNBA with the kind of mainstream cultural footprint that organizations spend years trying to manufacture. And Angel Reese, 7th overall. Chicago Sky, the forward from LSU, physical, relentless, and unapologetically electric, who had beaten Clark on the biggest stage women's college basketball has, whose animated celebration during the 2023 National Championship game became one of the most replayed clips in women's sports history, and who had cultivated one of the most loyal and vocal fan bases in the game. The WNBA's broadcast partners understood immediately what they were looking at. This wasn't just an interesting basketball subplot. This was appointment television with a built-in emotional architecture that you cannot purchase or manufacture. You either have it or you don't, and the league suddenly had it at a scale it had never experienced. Every time Clark and Reese shared a court in 2024, the numbers confirmed it. Viewership climbed. Social media engagement went into overdrive, arena demand in markets both teams visited escalated beyond anything those cities had seen for WNBA regular season contests in years. The league's marketing apparatus leaned into this dynamic aggressively. Matchups were scheduled prominently. Broadcast windows were arranged around them. The commissioner's office referenced the Clark-Reese narrative in public statements about the league's commercial growth trajectory. For an organization that had spent years fighting for mainstream sports legitimacy, this rivalry was the breakthrough moment that everything had been building toward, and every major financial stakeholder attached to the WNBA, broadcast partners, sponsors, franchise ownership groups, had built their 2024 and 2025 return projections with that breakthrough at the center. Inside the Chicago Sky's organization, though, the narrative was moving in a different direction. Sources had been whispering about friction between Reese and the franchise throughout the back half of the 2024 season. The precise nature of those tensions was never formally addressed by the organization, but the structural reality of Chicago's situation created a context that made the underlying dynamics legible. While Caitlin Clark was transforming the Indiana Fever into the WNBA's most commercially dominant franchise in a single season. Sellouts at Gainbridge Fieldhouse, record merchandise sales, national network TV windows, sponsorship activations at a scale the league rarely sees for any single market, Chicago was watching that transformation from a distance and asking an increasingly uncomfortable internal question. Was Angel Reese the kind of player who could do something equivalent for the Sky? The answer the organization appears to have settled on was not a straightforward yes. Reese generated headlines. She generated social media engagement at a scale most WNBA players could never approach. She was a genuine cultural presence in the league's public conversation, but attendance figures in Chicago didn't mirror what was happening in Indianapolis. The franchise wasn't accelerating toward playoff legitimacy in the way the front office needed it to. And in a league where Caitlin Clark had demonstrated in real time what a truly transcendent commercial force looks like, Chicago appeared to quietly revise its internal benchmark for what it needed and concluded that what it had in Angel Reese, as valuable as she was on the court and in the market, wasn't going to close that gap. There were whispers about Dallas. Multiple outlets reported that the Dallas Wings, preparing to select Paige Bueckers with the first overall pick in the 2025 draft, were exploring whether they could pair Bueckers with Reese for an immediate high-visibility partnership. Two major marketable names launching together in a new market. The appeal of that storyline was obvious from a commercial standpoint, and it would have represented a genuine competitive asset package for Chicago if Dallas had offered meaningful compensation. But that deal never materialized. Whatever conversations happened, they didn't produce terms either party was willing to accept. Instead, Chicago turned to Atlanta. And the terms they accepted, 2 future first-round picks and a second-round swap, right? Have been described by nearly every analytical voice covering this league as significantly below what a player of Reese's standing should generate in a competitive market. The speed with which Chicago closed this deal and the return they accepted closing it is the most important signal in this entire story. Organizations that believe they are trading a valued asset negotiate longer, push harder, and demand more. Organizations trying to resolve a situation they perceive as incompatible take what they can get and move on quickly. Everything about the execution of this trade points toward the second scenario. Commissioner Cathy Engelbert has built her tenure on the promise of growing the WNBA into a commercially sustainable mainstream sports property, and the Clark-Reese rivalry has been the single most valuable tool her office has had available to make that argument to investors, broadcast partners, and potential expansion markets. A season in which that rivalry disappeared, Reese staying in Chicago with no direct schedule emphasis connecting her to Clark would have been a measurable revenue event, not a catastrophe, but a real quantifiable loss at a moment when the league has every incentive to protect its upward trajectory. So when the scheduling department constructed a calendar in which Indiana faces Atlanta 4 times, more than any other opponent, before the trade that made that matchup commercially significant was ever announced publicly, The people asking whether the league had advanced knowledge of where Angel Reese was landing are not fringe theorists. They are asking precisely the right question. Before we follow this into its next layer, drop a comment right now and tell us, do you think the schedule being set before the Angel Reese trade was a coincidence, or do you think someone in the league office already knew exactly where she was going? We ask because the answer to that question is going to shape how you see every major WNBA transaction that comes after this one. 4 games Indiana Fever versus Atlanta Dream. More than any other pairing on the Fever's schedule, that result would be unremarkable if it reflected a division structure, a geographic cluster, or some standard scheduling logic. But the Fever and the Dream are not rivals in any structural sense. There's no historical or divisional reason this specific pairing should appear at the top of Indiana's matchup count. The standard explanation that an algorithm produced this result as part of a balanced scheduling process becomes extremely difficult to defend when you account for the timing. The schedule was constructed before the trade was announced, before Angel Reese was officially an Atlanta Dream player, and yet the calendar was already built as though that outcome was the assumed reality. Fans noticed within days of the schedule publication, conversations on X, Reddit, and fan forums were already pointing at this specific data point. The question being raised openly was whether Commissioner Engelbert's office had advanced knowledge of the Reese trade, either through official league communications with the franchises involved, or through some level of coordination that extended beyond what would be expected in a standard transaction between 2 independent teams. Because if the league was aware that Reese was heading to Atlanta before the deal closed, the scheduling outcome stops being a coincidence and starts being a policy choice. The league hasn't addressed this directly. No official spokesperson has offered a specific explanation for why Indiana and Atlanta appear at the top of the Fever's 2025 schedule. That silence is itself meaningful information. When organizations have a benign explanation for something that's generating pointed public scrutiny, they generally provide it. The continued absence of that explanation extends the window in which the alternative reading that advanced knowledge shaped the calendar remains the most coherent available interpretation of the evidence. Now layer on top of that the arena situation. The Atlanta Dream's current home facility holds approximately 3,500 people, 3,500 in a league trying to project commercial momentum. That number creates a fundamental problem for any marquee matchup staged inside it. You cannot drive significant gate revenue at 3,500 seats. You cannot generate the kind of visual spectacle that broadcast partners need for premium programming windows. You cannot signal to sponsors and franchise investors that this rivalry is operating at the level the league's own marketing claims. It is not from inside a 3,500-seat arena. The league already knew this because before the season began, it was announced that at least one of those 4 Indiana-Atlanta matchups would be relocated from the Dream's home facility to State Farm Arena, Atlanta's primary major events venue, which accommodates well over 20,000 people. That is not a minor scheduling accommodation. Moving a WNBA game from a 3,500-seat gym to a 20,000-plus seat arena requires months of advanced negotiation, venue coordination, operational planning, and commercial partnership alignment. You don't arrange that in the weeks following a trade announcement. That kind of relocation requires lead time. Which means that the decision to move an Indiana-Atlanta game to a larger Atlanta venue was likely in planning before or simultaneous with the trade itself, adding yet another layer to the timeline problem at the center of this story. The scheduling department built Indiana-Atlanta as a marquee matchup. The operations team arranged for at least one of those games to be elevated to a premium venue. All of this in a window that, by the public record, precedes the moment Angel Reese officially became an Atlanta Dream player. The organization of this infrastructure suggests that people with decision-making authority over the WNBA's commercial calendar were operating with a significant amount of certainty about where Reese was going, certainty that the general public and potentially the players themselves didn't have access to before we continue. If this channel's coverage has been your go-to resource for what's actually happening beneath the official WNBA narrative, consider joining us as a member. Your support is what makes it possible to keep doing the research and analysis that these stories require, because this level of reporting takes time and resources that your membership directly enables. Chicago now sits with the consequences of what it set in motion. With Reese gone and the draft picks it received from Atlanta not projecting to arrive as premium assets, the Sky's front office faces a genuine rebuild question with no obvious short-term answer. Camila Cardoso is the most frequently cited name as a potential cornerstone, the Brazilian center who showed real developmental promise during the 2024 season. But constructing a competitive team around a developing center without an established star at the perimeter who can generate commercial and competitive momentum is a project measured in years, not months. The more direct question being asked in league circles is whether Chicago has made a deliberate decision to accept a period of managed decline, accumulating assets and draft positioning while the rest of the league capitalizes on the Clark era, rather than trying to compete at the top tier with the roster and resources currently available. If that's the organizational philosophy underlying this trade, it explains the low return they accepted for Reese. 2 future picks aren't a windfall, but for a franchise in genuine rebuild mode, they are the beginning of an asset base. The Sky may have concluded that getting out of the Reese situation cleanly, even at a discount, was worth more to their long-term positioning than holding out for fair market value on a player they'd already decided wasn't part of their plan. If you've been following this breakdown and you think the people around you who watch the WNBA need to hear this analysis, share this video. The more people who understand the full picture of what's happening around this trade, the harder it becomes for the surface-level narrative to be the only conversation anyone is having. The financial stakes here are larger than any single transaction. WNBA franchise valuations have accelerated dramatically in the Clark era, driven by the commercial premium her presence places on every market she touches and every game that features the league's signature storylines. Ownership groups that have recently acquired WNBA franchises or are exploring expansion opportunities are making investment decisions based on the assumption that the league's commercial trajectory continues upward. That trajectory is not evenly distributed, it is concentrated around specific assets, and no asset has generated more reliable commercial return over the past 2 years than the Clark-Reese dynamic. Broadcast partners structured their 2025 programming projections around the continuation of that matchup. Major sponsors attached to league marketing built return on investment assumptions around premium Clark-Reese games. The league's own attendance models for 2025 were built with those matchups as revenue peaks, a scenario in which that rivalry disappears. Reese marooned in Chicago, Clark in Indianapolis. No elevated schedule connection between them would have represented a measurable revenue contraction at the worst possible moment for an organization trying to demonstrate to the broader sports business market that women's basketball has arrived as a permanent commercial force. That financial exposure is the context in which you have to understand both the trade and the schedule. The WNBA had a powerful economic incentive to ensure that Clark and Reese were facing each other in 2025. The question of whether that incentive translated into active influence on a transaction between 2 franchises, or at minimum into advanced knowledge that shaped how the league's calendar was constructed, is the question that should be at the center of every conversation about this trade. Not whether Chicago made a bad deal, not whether Atlanta got a steal. Those things are both true, and they are both secondary to the larger question of who was operating the machinery that produced this outcome. Here's what you need to sit with as this story develops. The WNBA is a business commissioner. Engelbert runs it as one, and she has done so with genuine skill during a period of real commercial expansion. But businesses make decisions based on their financial interests, and the financial interests of the WNBA as an institution are not always identical to the competitive and contractual interests of the individual franchises within it. If the league office had advanced knowledge of the Reese trade, or if league commercial interests created conditions that accelerated or shaped the transaction, then the teams, players, and fans operating inside what they believe is a transparent competitive system deserve to understand what they're actually participating in. Angel Reese is in Atlanta. Caitlin Clark is in Indiana. 4 times this season, in front of crowds the WNBA could only dream about a few years ago, in arenas that will be configured to handle the demand. They are going to share a court. That outcome serves the league's commercial interests more than any other possible configuration of those 2 players. Whether Chicago made that happen, or whether someone with a broader view of the board made sure it was going to happen regardless, is the thread this story is pulling on. And as the 2025 season unfolds, and more details about the timeline of this transaction come to light, we will be here following every development. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're here the moment the next piece of this falls into place. And while you're waiting for that, go back and watch our breakdown of how the WNBA's new broadcast deals are reshaping power dynamics across every franchise in the league, because the financial structure we described in that video is the exact engine behind everything that's happening right now.